afternoon, Mr. Commissioner. Brenda Gertner, and with me Leah Pence for the First Nations Coalition. I just want to start by marking the exhibit that I was referring to just at the end of this morning's questions as the next exhibit. It was First Nations Coalition's document number 3, or tab 3.
Marked as exhibit 847.
Gentlemen, I want to go next to just a few questions around timeliness and catch monitoring information. And in particular, has it been your experience that obtaining accurate and timely in-season numbers is becoming increasingly important, not only with the implementation of the wild salmon policy, but with the weak stock management approaches, and also potentially with the movement towards increasing the types of fisheries that we have in river, so that we're going to need more numbers more accurately and more timely in season?
Yes.
Dr. Hootman, would you also agree with that?
Yes.
And Mr. Paslow?
Yes.
I wonder if I could also then now turn to Exhibit 840. And we've been looking at that document a couple times this morning, and it reports on the timeliness of some of the, and this is a question for you, Dr. Hootman. I noticed that in both Area D and the Area E gill netters, in particular in 2010, the Area D from Johnson Strait and the Georgia Strait, if I've got that right, the gill netters had only 17% of their reports in on time. And then in Area E, gill netters had only 31% of the reports in on time. Could you?
Page 1.
Page 1? Sorry, page 1, yes. So we've got in Area D, 17% of the reports in are on time for the Georgia Strait and Johnson Strait area. In Area E, the Fraser gill netters have only 31% of their reports in on time. By my review of that, that would cause me some concerns. Does that also cause you some concerns, Doctor?
Some concerns. Fishery managers have other, as was mentioned earlier in the day, other information from on the grounds to work with as well. So this isn't the sole information they have, but they do. The reasons for the deadlines for these in-season, for these phone-in catch reports being so soon after fishing is because the managers have expressed the need for the data. So it is a concern, yes.
Yes. Commissioner Cohen has heard a lot about in-season management challenges and the various uses of those numbers and the increasing importance on them. So what's DFO doing to address, what are the challenges that these fishermen have as it relates to getting this information to you, and what is DFO doing to try to address it?
In Area D, at least, there's communication challenges. There could be, for certain areas of fishing, there could be challenges with just electronic communications. So that could be a part of the reason. That's not the case in the Fraser River Area E fishing. So
what steps are you taking in order to address this?
I'm not sure if there's sort of enhanced enforcement being planned for that particular.
So in catch monitoring and the work
compliance.
that you're doing, you're not doing anything at this point in time?
I'm not directly involved in any solution.
Have you got any suggestions on how to improve the timeliness of reporting in these areas?
Managers continue to express the need for the importance of it to the fleets. Fleets have responded in lots of ways to improving catch reporting. Some enforcement action or attention to this would be appropriate, and I think it would provide some solution.
So that's a recommendation that you would like the Commissioner to consider? Sorry, could you answer the question, yes or no?
Yeah, yes.
Thank you. I'm going to turn to consistency in a moment, but Mr. Jentz, this morning both Mr. Parslow and Dr. Hootman answered the question about their estimate of accuracy in the areas that they're responsible for, but we didn't hear from you, and I wonder if you could join the group in giving some estimate of the accuracy you feel you have in the Middle and Upper Fraser River.
Certainly. It's quite different depending on the area within the BC Interior. So the intense fishery that I was discussing previously in the Mid-River, we have a very structured and sophisticated program in place there, which the assessment of the catch information during periods of time when we have the kind of program in place that we have been having the last couple of years with the funding levels that we have, we're generating catch estimates that are 90%, within 10% accuracy levels, so 10 plus or minus 10%. In some of the other areas, it varies considerably. We can't do a real rigorous statistical analysis of it, but we have some of the kinds of catch monitoring information that we receive are considered census, so a complete estimate of the catch. They're done through telephone interviews of fishers who may have participated in the fishery, so we have no way of actually assessing it. I feel that in most cases the catch information is pretty complete, as best as they can do, but it could be significantly biased if fishers have trouble remembering how many fish they did catch, because quite often in these terminal areas, there's a handful of fishers that go fishing. The catch monitors will phone them at the end of the season and ask them how many fish they caught over the season. So again, it depends on the fishery, but the intense fishery where the majority of the fish is caught, we have a pretty well-structured, sophisticated program in place.
You'll agree with me in those other places, the amount of fishing is quite small relative to the other places in the river, and the nature of the concerns are quite small.
Yes, it is.
Now, just picking up on issues of timeliness, I want to go to issues of consistency amongst the different sectors. Do you agree, for those of you that have been working in this field a bit longer than perhaps even those that have had a shorter time, that historically some of the acrimony between DFO and First Nations, and also between commercial, recreational First Nation fisheries, that creates the distrust is the apparent unevenness amongst the types of catch monitoring that's going on?
That is one of the concerns that has been raised, as well as comments that views of one particular group is that the other group is not monitored at all. So there's a variety. The level of monitoring and some concerns about no monitoring as well. And
the no monitoring concerns generally arise as it relates to the recreational fisheries?
It's actually, I've heard it both ways, and I think the expectation of some of the clients out there is that we need to have monitoring of every fishery every day. And when they're out, as an example, when they're out on a sport fishery and they see an FSC boat drift by with a net and there isn't any monitoring in place, they use that as an opportunity to suggest that there's no monitoring in place for that particular fishery. So when in fact there may be monitoring, it might be in another section of the river on that particular day. So I think a lot of it's associated with a level of some lack of knowledge of what the actual catch program is all about.
All right, I'm going to just take you to our document, tab 15, and is that right? And that's a memorandum for the Regional Director General. It's a 2009 plan for improving commercial salmon fishery monitoring. I'll go to the third bullet on page 1. Current FMCR standards across the salmon fleets are uneven. I wonder if any of you could speak about that, or speak about the concerns that were being raised in that document.
I can speak a bit about the unevenness. Certain license areas have had validation for some time. Other license areas don't. So Area F has had validation requirements for about 5 years, at least in Chinook, for Chinook fishing. And then last year, Area B and Area H added it. So there's some unevenness there, validation requirements for some, not for others. There's also some differences in deadlines for reporting, making the phone-in catch reports. And there's some slight differences in requirements, what needs to be reported from SANE versus Gilnet. SANERs have a requirement to, SANERs in Area B have a requirement to make offload catch reports as well.
I'll then take you to page 3 of that document, and it's the second dark bullet, where it confirms that First Nations economic opportunity fishing monitoring will continue to require 100% enumeration. And that's your understanding, Dr. Hootman. Can you tell me why it is that there's 100% enumeration in First Nations economic opportunities and this uneven differences amongst the commercial fishermen, and what what steps DFO is taking to try to address that?
In Area E in the Fraser, we've increased the validation requirement from, I believe, 0 to 35%.
Why hasn't it gone to 100%?
I'm not sure of all the reasons, but I believe one of the reasons is the concern about ensuring catch is separated between First Nations economic catch and AFS catch. The validation helps to ensure that that separation is more complete. I guess Matt might be able to add to that.
There's two ways of approaching this question. I'll turn to you in a second, Matt, if I may. But there's one way is to increase commercial fisheries, or the other is to decrease First Nations enumerations. From your perspective in the commercial fishery, do we need to increase it from the estimates of 35% in Area E to 100% or to a higher percentage, or where are we going with that?
If you ask me, is 35%, if it's a random sample and it's 35%, that's a suitable sample for a high quality estimate. There's concerns around whether it's a representative sample and difficulties ensuring that it is. But if it is, that's a suitable sample for answering the question of the total catch. There's other questions that may need to be asked if you need to break that catch out into smaller units for different groups or something.
So statistically, you need about 35% of enumeration in order to provide reliable catch estimates in an in-season management regime?
I can't say that across the board. It depends on the fleet size.
Well, with Area E?
With Area E, with about 300 vessels fishing, that's sort of the number we came up with, that's right. But it also depends on the variability in the catches amongst the fleet. But with a fleet size of about 300, that seemed to be an appropriate sample size.
Mr. Parslow, why do you need 100% for the economic opportunities in the Lower Fraser that are using gill netters then?
My understanding, this was a program that was developed before my arrival at the Lower Fraser, but I think it's a different way of getting at an estimate of catch. So there's other pieces of information which we aren't currently collecting in the First Nations fishery, which we would need to then incorporate into our program in order to be able to estimate catch based on a subsample, 35% or whatever that might be.
Sorry,
I can add a little as well, if you'd like.
Sure, Mr. Dennis.
One of the issues that we have with the economic opportunity fishery in the Lower Fraser River is that it's being conducted in an area and at the same time often when FSC fisheries are ongoing, and there is a need to keep the catches separate of those two particular fisheries so that we are ensuring that FSC caught fish, so people who are not licensed to fish in the economic opportunity fishery are not bringing their catch into the economic opportunity fishery. So there's need to make sure that there's clear separation, and one of the decisions around that was to make sure that we have complete and accurate information in relation to the economic opportunity fishery.
Sorry, I accept that there may be some value in it as it relates to the Lower Fraser fishery, but I'm having difficulty understanding why 35% is acceptable for Area E and it's not acceptable for the Lower Fraser economic opportunity fisheries.
Well, I think the main reason is that the Area E fishermen are commercial fishermen. They aren't out fishing for food, social, ceremonial at the same time. Those fisheries are separate in time and space than the FSC fisheries. when Area E is open for a commercial opening, there are no FSC openings in the lower river at that particular time, is my understanding.
Yeah.
One of the perceptions that my clients have, and questions or concerns they have, perhaps it's a concern, is that the increased monitoring that's occurring as it relates to First Nations fisheries, whether they're economic opportunities or otherwise, comes from a history of distrust as distinct from a history of or a present need. And secondly, that it's occurring at the expense of habitat and other work. And I'd like each of you to, the increased costs of monitoring in the Lower Fraser, I'm just responding to a question mark I saw on the face, is happening at the expense of habitat and other work. And I'd like to hear from, first of all, you, Mr. Parslow, around your thoughts on that, and then Mr. Jentz, and then Dr. Hootman.
And so you're interested in
Twofold.
the increased funding and its effect on habitat work and other work on
That's
of
the
that
second
nature?
question. So I actually asked two questions in that because there's the two concerns. First of all, that really the reason for the 100% requirements for enumeration and otherwise is a history of distrust, not the present need. And secondly, that doing all of this and doing all of this monitoring is at the expense of habitat and other work that's going on.
Okay, well, I think that, as Les was mentioning, I think there's still a need to keep the fisheries separate, the catch occurring in an EO fishery and that occurring in an FSC fishery. So I think that need still remains. I think in terms of the increased funding and its effect on habitat, I don't know if I could speak to that. I'm sure if funding wasn't provided to the monitoring programs, it could be reprofiled to cover off habitat costs with discussion, but yeah.
Mr. Jentz?
I don't think I have much more to add than what Mr. Parslow has said. The funding that we receive is for resource management, for catch monitoring, is a different funding envelope than habitat altogether. Certainly having reduced costs within a catch monitoring program may end up at a decision point where the monies could be used for other projects. But within the current structure we have, those dollars are within resource management and not within OHEB. So I suppose at some point that transition could occur, but they come through different funding envelopes, different channels altogether. But the importance here of the requirement to have the 100% enumeration is related to keeping the catch between FSC and commercial separate. So certainly reduced costs could be redirected elsewhere. Whether it goes to habitat or not would be a decision that would be made by others.
Dr. Hootman?
Yeah, whether or not it's there's a history of distrust, I think that the reasons for this current approach to monitoring are justified based on current needs. There's requirements for commercial fishers in Area E that aren't shared by the First Nations groups. For example, sales slip generation, logbook reporting, other source of data that are available to fishery managers to estimate catch that aren't required from First Nations. Also, vessels have to have their unique identifier visible on the vessels for commercial, but I believe that's not the case in First Nations. So there's real challenges, there's real differences in how the two fisheries can be monitored.
Just want to move next to some of the relationship issues that we've touched upon briefly, and let's just begin first with relationship issues between DFO and, sorry, I didn't mark the last document as an exhibit.
Exhibit 848.
And before I turn to some of the challenges associated with the relationship amongst First Nations and this recreational and commercial fishers, can I talk, let's specifically turn to the relationship between First Nations and DFO. I just have a couple of questions. One is just the understanding and the challenges associated with providing numbers. And I'm not sure. I think I'm going to start with you, Mr. Jens, because I suppose I've worked with you in other factors, and I've seen you in other places a couple of times. And so is it your understanding, and can you confirm for the Commissioner, that there's a historical resistance that some of the First Nations have to providing DFO numbers, including catch numbers, because they're sometimes not sure how they're going to be used, and in particular whether they'll be used against them at any particular time?
I think that's a fair comment, yes.
And that's one of the challenges that you're facing in your work, and also one of the opportunities you have in terms of working towards co-management. Is that correct?
It does come up occasionally, yes.
So the benefits of finding avenues for co-management and how we can all use these numbers well together is something that you're pursuing with the First Nations that you're working with.
Yes, and I think a lot of progress has been made in that regard.
And part of that's an educational issue, and part of that is also a recognition of their rights and responsibilities. Is that correct?
It's a two-way educational issue, yes.
Absolutely. And Mr. Parslow, would you agree with that also?
Yes.
All right. So then the next challenge associated with that is the difference between CNP and catch monitoring programs. And in particular, I wanted to turn you to, as an example of experiences, Commission Document Number 9. And Mr. Parslow, I think this is a question of you. This is an exchange of emails, contains an emails from Arthur Dembski at CNP and Sheldon Evers, I believe, then Maria Maxwell, and then on to you. Can you identify that email exchange?
Yes, I can.
Yes, and perhaps we could have that email exchange marked as the next exhibit then.
Exhibit 848, or 849.
And can you comment on the views expressed by Mr. Dembski or CNP more broadly? Is this kind of institutional challenge or bias is still alive in CNP? And what can you, from your perspective, what do you think can be done here?
You're speaking towards the concern expressed that the numbers aren't reflective of what's happening in the fishery?
That's correct. And if you would like, he can scroll back down if you need to have your memory refreshed on this exchange.
Sure. Yeah, I think this is the issue at stake here is actually released and kept numbers of sockeye during the early Stuart window closure. So there's First Nations fisheries licensed during this period of time in the Lower Fraser River to use drift nets with a larger size mesh with the intention of reducing sockeye impacts. And so the observation made by the officers was that fishers weren't screening the fish and trying to take out sockeye. And I think that the concern was that the numbers that were submitted would potentially be inflated for releases. And I think the views expressed by the resource management staff that really the retained numbers were quite good, because I think that there wasn't a push from management to push for numbers to be reported at a lower level. I think that, I think there is a bit of a discrepancy between the officers on the grounds and resource management potentially.
Maybe I'll just go one more step further with you. It's my understanding that there's been an internal shift, and this is my client's understanding that they've passed on to me, of course, internal shift to the organizational structure of DFO as it pertains to CNP, and that's slightly different than what's used in catch monitoring, whereas CNP is now doing a full line reporting relationship as opposed to a matrix management model within DFO. Is that something you can confirm?
I don't think I could speak to that too much.
Is that something you, Mr. Jens, can you speak to that?
That is a decision that actually came from the Williams review. That was a recommendation, I believe, out of the Williams review, that the fishery officers would be a direct line of report up through to the RDG in the Pacific region. Historically, there was an area-based relationship where they reported to area directors. So that was changed, and I think, if I'm not mistaken, that was one of the recommendations that came out of it.
I wonder if you're experiencing what I'm going to propose to you next. If you're not, we'll ask these questions directly of Chief Galloway tomorrow. But my client's experience with this change in how CNP is operating is they're much more removed from the on-the-ground day-to-day, CNP is, on-the-ground relationship and management issues than they were before, and that's causing difficulties and challenges, some of which we see as reflected in this email exchange or otherwise. Is that an experience that you're also sharing on the ground, and some of the challenges associated with relationships between DFO and First Nations?
That may be true in some areas. I think there are efforts in a number of areas, and in particular in the BCI, and I'm pretty certain in the Lower Fraser as well, where resource management and CNP do get together pre-season to discuss issues associated with the fisheries and establish priorities for CNP as far as what our issues may be from a resource management perspective, so that they're aware of that and they design their enforcement programs around that. So there is exchange going on. Whether it's better or worse than the way things were done before, in some areas it may be worse. I can't speak for them, but I know in the BC Interior that we do meet periodically, maybe not as often as we should, or could, or would like to, but we do meet to discuss these things.
Mr. Parslow, is there anything you'd like to add as it relates to the Lower Fraser?
Yeah, I would say there's ongoing work to build this the relationship between CNP and resource management on the grounds, towards on the grounds work. I can't unfortunately speak to before the Williams review because that was before my time with the department.
But it's a problem you're experiencing, and you think there could be some improvements there?
I don't know if it's a problem, but you know, I guess it's something which is it's maintaining that relationship and continuing the conversation around collection of data and provision.
All right, now I want to speak briefly about the work, and I expect that we'll get into some detail on this with the panel tomorrow, but I want to speak briefly about the development of better understandings and trust amongst First Nations and the recreational and the commercial sectors. And someone spoke earlier, I think it was you, Mr. Parslow, spoke earlier today about some work that's going on in the Lower Fraser. Were you referring to the Fraser River Salmon Table Society and the work that's happening there between First Nations and recreational fisheries?
That's correct, yes.
I wonder if I could turn to document 18 of our list. Now, the other thing I want to pick up on is a question that Mr. Eidsvik asked of you earlier today about how at area e-meetings there tends to be laughter when you're reporting on the accuracy of First Nations fisheries FSC catch monitoring and reporting. And I want to specifically turn to the work that's been done by the Fraser River Salmon Table Society. And I noted in this document, right on the front page, a quote from Mike Griswold of Area H, and I'm going to read the quote. "There has been lots of accusations around Stala fishing that has little or no basis in fact. Yesterday we were able to see firsthand that the fisheries were being run just like commercial fisheries should." Are you familiar with Mike? Do you know Mike?
I've met Mike probably once or twice.
Do you agree with me that that was a nice revelation that Mike experienced at the Fraser River Salmon Table?
Yep.
Yes. And would you agree with me that it's this type of work that's becoming critically important for building sector understandings, is actually letting the commercial fisheries or the recreational fisheries learn firsthand the hard work that's going on in the Fraser River and otherwise for fish monitoring?
Yes, and I think that goes in all cases. I think education is a huge part of this and is key to building this understanding of what's happening in each of the sectors, each of the fisheries.
I wonder if any of the rest of you could comment. I see a lot of head nodding in the positive direction, but it would be useful to have your comments.
I was just in agreement.
I know Mike and quite well, through a number of years of experience and processes, and it's nice to see those kinds of comments being made.
And so that one of the factors that we're really dealing with is often more stereotypes than it is actual factual information. Is that correct?
You could, yeah, certainly that is one explanation, and I think another is, as I mentioned previously, that sometimes one person's view at a particular location at a particular time may be somewhat biased because he doesn't see the whole picture. So I think it's important to get a better understanding and appreciation of the fisheries and all of the programs associated with it before one makes an opinion on them.
Thank you. Could I have this document marked as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 850.
Now, my last rounds of questions are really speaking more in generality, I suppose, and I want to get to some of the challenges that you were brought to this morning in a little bit more detail, and then a couple of questions around where we go from here. And I'll go first to Exhibit 420, no, sorry, FNF's First Nation Coalition document number 5. On the very last page is the, first of all, Mr. Parslow, are you familiar with this presentation?
Yes, I am.
Is this yours?
No, this was actually produced before I took this position.
But you're aware of this
Yes.
Can I have this marked as the next exhibit?
Exhibit 851.
I wonder if I could go to the last page of the exhibit where we list some of the challenges. And we've spoken a little bit about the second one. I wasn't quite sure what the concern was as it related to the first bullet, and I wonder if either Mr. Jantz or Mr. Parslow could comment on that. I think everyone has it in front of them.
I think increasingly they are getting focus during agreement negotiations, I would say. I think the reason why this, and I can't speak to it because I'm not the author, but is probably in that the fish numbers and that side of things is much more a focus in the development of these agreements. I don't know if Les could speak to it further.
When I read that sentence, what it says to me is that the view of whoever put this deck together is that the existing catch programs are sufficient. They don't require additional resources to go into them. In other words, they feel that the catch information that's being derived in the lower river is of adequate accuracy.
And I wonder if this might also be a problem, that if when existing agreements are negotiated and implemented and then catch monitoring becomes more important, there isn't funding in the agreement.
It's often difficult to move funding from one area to another because we do not get new AFS resources unless there's a reprofiling from within the Pacific region or within another area.
So that
But
could,
generally, there's very limited ability to increase AFS agreements.
so to the extent that you're relying on AFS for funding catch monitoring, there's very little flexibility in improving or increasing the amount of money that's being spent on catch monitoring.
In most years.
All right. The next bullet I wanted to take you to was the third bullet, and in which you say, or in which the list of challenges is management decisions often made without considering implications for catch monitoring. And both Mr. Jantz and Mr. Parslow, I wonder if you could comment on what that challenge is and where we might be going with that one. Unless, Dr. Hootman, you also have a way of contributing to that.
Yeah. I think what this is speaking to is if fisheries are planned, which may pose challenges for operation of a catch monitoring program or operation of an effective catch monitoring program. I mean, there's a whole bunch of different options there, but that's the main piece, is that we might be running fisheries which are harder to assess and potentially harder to, get it.
I think what has been said is correct. So a particular example would be a decision's made to open a fishery And we've already got our catch monitors already fully subscribed in other fisheries that are ongoing, and we don't have the ability to move them over to monitor that fishery. So that would be an example of that kind of a challenge. So if we don't have the resources to monitor a new fishery or a significant change from a fishery from our pre-season plan, then it is a challenge.
And then the next, at least the next two, it seem to suggest the increasing demands, either they be sampling or data management requirements at a First Nations level and at a DFO level. Have I got that right?
Yeah.
And again, I want to go back to that first bullet then. We've got increasing demands and we've got static agreements. Is that a useful way of summarizing some of these challenges?
Static agreements.
Agreements that are worth about the same amount
Yeah.
of money and no flexibility to move things around.
And in the case of some areas, reduced department funding, annual reductions in department funding as well.
All right. My next round of questions is really around the differences. You've heard a little bit about it when you, Mr. Jens, you talked about the differences in the type of fisheries. Will you also agree with me that there's differences in capacity amongst First Nations to assist at a technical level as it relates to data management and catch monitoring?
Yes, definitely.
And what steps is DFO taking to assess those differences and to respond differently as it relates to those differences?
We have, as I mentioned previously as well, we annually conduct an orientation program with the various monitors throughout the areas. Some areas have a more intense orientation program delivered to them, reflective of the kind of program that they're involved in. Others do not have as intense a program. And as well, through the PICFI initiative, there is ongoing development of curriculum and various other things to try to assist the groups to improve their monitoring abilities and understanding and sampling and a variety of different things. So there is ongoing work to try to establish programs, better educational programs to improve the monitoring and understanding of monitors of the requirements of a particular fishery and its program.
Are you familiar with the Atligay programs?
Yes.
And as I understand it, that's a software tool for First Nations catch data management.
Yes.
And how many First Nations approximately are using within the Fraser watershed, are using the Atligay system?
I'll speak for the interior. We have 3 or 4 groups that currently have the Atligay program.
Actually, let me help you on this, Mr. Jens.
Okay.
Could we go to document 21 of the First
that would
Nations
help.
Coalitions and sorry, slide number 17. I wasn't trying to ask you a trick question. I just hadn't caught up with my notes. Page 7 or slide 17.
There,
That's-
so I said 4. So 4 are operational. There's 4 that I think do have the software but are not currently using it. And just further to the Atligay model and the program itself, within the BC Interior, we the department have worked with First Nations and already have some programs that are out there. So the Atligay program provided some additional benefits for information tracking to First Nation organizations, which is why a lot of them have expressed an interest to utilizing it. It was a tool that was established in areas that didn't have very good catch monitoring programs. I believe initially the Atligay model was initially developed and has grown and been used in other areas. So it is a tool that does assist in compiling catch information. It has its limitations though, which I think they've been trying to work on, but it still is it's a useful tool for collecting information.
And would you agree that capacity, not only as it relates to funding, but also in the development of the technical skills and the data management people is a necessary part of improving and implementing the system?
Yes.
And that we need to carefully ensure that that type of funding is found somewhere within the funding provided to First Nations?
If this is a tool that's going to be used in the future, certainly there will be training requirements that would need to be funded.
Training requirements, and also this is the type of thing that you'd want to encourage people to take a job and stick with it for a longer time, so you'd also want longer term funding for these
Certainly.
types of positions. Is
Yeah.
that correct?
Certainly.
And it's been your experience, has it, that that's valuable, for example, in the Lower Fraser with some of the longer-term employees?
Yes, that's correct.
Could I have this marked as the next exhibit? I'm wondering if I could now go to the Policy and Practice Report number 12, and in particular, I want to go to paragraphs 192 and 193. Those paragraphs summarize the challenges expressed by both DFO and First Nations regarding fisheries monitoring and catch reporting for Aboriginal fisheries. And I really want to use it as a way of focusing on where we can do steps to improve and what kinds of recommendations we might want going forward. There's discussions about more work needed for all to trust the numbers and trust the use that will be made of those numbers. We've heard a lot of that in the generality again today, and it's always useful to increase trust, and for sure my clients are definitely interested in that. What does that mean? What do you want to do? What do you want funding for? How are you going to get it done? Who should be doing it?
So could you please?
We've heard a lot of discussion
Yeah.
about let's trust each other's numbers, let's understand them more, let's figure out how to do them. We also hear a lot about limited budgets and ever decreasing budgets for DFO. How are we going to do this better, and how are we going to do it efficiently, and how much more time, and what's your vision for this going forward?
Well, I think part of the answer is the outcome of the strategic framework that we were talking about earlier today, and the ranking, or for lack of a better term, of the different fisheries that we have out there, what level of information is required for the different kinds of fisheries, and that's going to guide you in making decisions around what kind of a program you're going to need to have in place for that particular fishery. And once you're at that point, you can then compare it to the current program that may be in place, and then you make some decisions around are you able to modify your program to achieve those objectives, and if so, how? But it certainly at this point, I think you know, in order to get some of these fisheries up, you're going to need to have additional resources to do that. Whether you can find those resources within your existing budget from some other fishery that might be deemed to have a lower level of monitoring required, then those are the kinds of things that you need to do. First of all, you need to check to see if you can move your resources internally, and if you can't, then somehow, if you need to meet these certain requirements, then the need for additional resources will make itself very clear.
Maybe I'll just follow up on that and then turn to you, Mr. President. But how are you going to measure the results or the success of that? And how long do you anticipate taking to get there? I mean, it's the kind of generality that gets my clients a little worried, and we want to make sure this, I mean, not in a critical way, but more in a curious way. What do you see? You've been working in the Fraser watershed for a while now, Mr. Jazz. You've been working with First Nations. What's a reasonable time estimate for doing some of this? And what's the vision for how we're going to mark success?
My own personal view is the sooner we do it, the better off we are. But within the current environment of funding, it becomes very challenging. So, I mean, that's the key driver behind this whole thing, is that the increased demand to have more accurate catch data means more resources. And I unfortunately have no control on that. So those are the limitations, and if we get to a point where more dollars are available, then you can begin to address the issues. So sooner the better, but I'm not the controller on that.
One more follow-up question on that one. Mr. Jantz, you were involved in the Skeena Fisheries Commission before you came to the Fraser, is that correct?
Many years ago.
And they worked towards something called a structured collaboration process. Are you familiar with that?
Oh, boy. I don't recall it. I'm sorry.
All right. Mr. Parslow, is there anything you'd like to add to what should we be doing? How can we measure the successes? What's our time frames for doing it? How can we be efficient? All those types of specific questions around those general principles.
Yeah, I think Les has really covered off the vast majority of that. I think the one thing which I would say is something to consider is that I think this is going to be an ongoing process. It's not something which will have programs which are good forevermore. I think that the power in this framework document is that you can reassess depending on what the pressures are on that fishery and potentially modify your programs accordingly. So there may not be an end date to this, I guess is what I'm saying.
I'm curious that a significant amount of the money, or some, I guess significance is a relative term, but a sufficient amount of money is spent in the AFS for this work, either that or PICFI picked it up. From my client's perspective, that means the First Nations and the First Nations budgets are sometimes carrying the ball for a lot of this. Is your view that there should be funding that's provided outside of the AFS and otherwise to do this relationship work and provide for the increased monitoring that's necessary?
That is one option.
Just a correction, one last question, it's a minor correction, I believe. If we could go to the policy and practice report at paragraphs 148 and 149. Paragraph 148 outlines the various different levels of monitoring for food, social, and ceremonial fisheries, low, moderate, and enhanced. And then at paragraph 49, it says, at present, it does not appear that this categorization has yet been applied to First Nations fisheries. I wondered if you agreed with me on that, and the reason why I asked the question, or agree with that, not with me, I didn't write that, agree with that or not, because it's my understanding that there are different approaches to catch monitoring amongst the First Nations fisheries, even on the Fraser River. Very different in the lower Fraser as distinct from the upper Fraser. And so should we tweak paragraph 149?
I think through default, we've come to this kind of a structure in the programs that we have for FSC fisheries and monitoring programs in the Fraser River. We don't call them enhanced or low or basic or medium, but based on the fishery, the potential impact of the fishery, the number of fish that are generally harvested in it, we do structure our programs and direct dollars accordingly. Again, we don't categorize them in this way. These are new terms that are being applied to the different kinds of programs. So the statement is correct in that we don't categorize them that way, but they've, as I say, through default, we basically pigeonholed the different kinds of programs based on similar kinds of criteria.
And the categorization that we're talking about is, in some ways, the building of trust and the education process that we need to happen amongst the sectors.
The views of others certainly are not necessarily in line with the kind of program that are in place for some of these fisheries.
And so through the categorization and the work, we're going to try to build a consensus.
I think so.
All right. We'll hear more about that tomorrow, I expect. Those are my questions, Mr. Commissioner.
Mr. Commissioner, Nicole Chavez, co-counsel for Stola Tribal Council and Chiam Indian Band. I just have a few questions to clarify a few points made, gentlemen. Now, you'd agree with me that over the last years you've seen a move away from fisheries agreements that are signed with individual bands or groups more to comprehensive fisheries agreements, especially in the Lower Fraser.
Sorry, I'm involved in some of the agreements, but not all of the agreements. I guess there are, I don't know if I could speak to the modifications.
No, that's fine, but I just want to clarify something when it comes to the comprehensive fisheries agreements that you're seeing in the Lower Fraser, for example. Those contain an overall FSC, so comprehensive fisheries agreements are now addressed at a number of groups or bands, right? You agree with that,
yeah.
Right? All allocation of FSC fish under it.
I think, yeah, they have it's my understanding, yes.
So it's not for individual bands, or it's not separated out. There's an overall allocation in the comprehensive fisheries agreement.
I believe so, for the group of bands which the agreement is with.
Correct.
That's my
And then the incentive for signing such a comprehensive fisheries agreement, and for specific bands to sign on to such a comprehensive fisheries agreement, is the economic opportunity component that is under it, right?
I think that might be one of the benefits, but again, I'm not a resource manager.
No,
I
that's
can't
fine.
speak to that in detail.
But when it comes to that, now, if there is if the bands that sign on, right, like there's then the issue of bands that sign on that you would refer to as signatory bands and non-signatory bands, right? Now, I'm going to take you to an example that involves a signatory band, right? And there is an opening for an economic opportunity opening, right? In that circumstance, all the fish have to be landed and hand counted. If the band has signed on, all the fish for that band and for the signatory band have to be landed and hand counted, whether they are going to sale or they're taken home.
That's correct, yes.
Okay, so actually, if you're a signatory band, then all your fish will be 100% counted.
During the economic opportunity licensed fisheries, so fisheries with sale allowed, then yes.
Okay, so it would include FSC fish in that circumstance.
If there are fish that are taken home for FSC purposes, then yes, it would include those fish. But the same monitoring program is not in place for an FSC opening without the option, like just a straight FSC.
Correct, but
for the same.
There is circumstances where, for example, the first opening is an economic opportunity opening, right? And you're aware that a great number of that fish will go to FSC and actually to food, and it still gets 100% counted, right?
Yeah, any fish caught in that fishery should be going through a landing site.
Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that, if you're under a comprehensive fisheries agreement, you're a signatory band, and there's an economic opportunity opening, all fish will be counted, and otherwise there could be the issue that the person not having a ticket in that circumstance could be charged, right? Like with unauthorized possession of the fish, correct?
Yeah, that's my understanding, yes.
Okay, I think we needed to clarify that. Now, another point, I think you spoke to that issue as well, that when it comes to AFS monies for monitoring, right? I take it you're aware that there is a number of groups, and I think it can be put to the panel also, in the interior of BC that have made a political decision not to sign AFS agreements because they don't agree with some of the provisions in AFS agreements. You'd agree with me on that?
Yes, that's true.
Okay, so it's not as, for example, as a consequence that they don't get AFS monies, but there can be circumstances where groups take a political decision not to sign AFS agreements, correct?
Yes.
Yet the majority of the funding for monitoring, especially in the Lower Fraser, gets channeled through AFS agreements.
Yes, I would say so.
That's correct. Okay, thank you. Those are my questions.
Mr. Commissioner, I'm not sure what your preference is. Ms. Sharp is next. She has approximately 10 minutes, I understand, and there will be a brief re-examination as well.
Hello, I am Sarah Sharp. I'm here for the Western Central Coast Salish First Nations. I just have a few questions here for you. First, I wanted to go to the, we were talking about the costs of some of the commercial programs. The logbooks was one of the ones that we talked about earlier, that those can be quite expensive for maintaining.
Yeah, we were talking about that, yep. And
The expense of maintaining logbooks, that's borne by the commercial fishermen, is it?
that's correct.
Okay,
And-
and you also, sorry?
Yeah, just to remember, we all say logbooks, but it's the whole program associated with it. It's a lot of labor on the call center and data management
Okay.
stuff, not just a book.
You also mentioned that sales slips are used for the commercial fishermen.
That's right.
Okay, we've heard that those are less reliable as a source of information.
Currently and in the South Coast, they're considered less reliable, yes.
Okay, but you did use that as one of the sources of data that's used, that justifies why the commercial fishery doesn't have maybe the same level of monitoring as the First Nations fishery?
I was just using it to explain that there's other examples of discrepancies or different levels of, different requirements for the commercial fishery than the economic opportunity fishery.
Okay, because we have...
It doesn't all, not all that. The burden's greater for the economic opportunity fishery. That was an example where the burden is greater for the commercial fishery.
Okay, because we have actually heard previous to now that the problems with the sales slips has resulted in a change in the way catch monitoring is assessed, and there's been whole programs for replacing data for that period of time.
That's right. Sales slips are still required. They're not as essential to coming up with catch estimates, but they are still part of the paper trail and have value.
Onboard observers, you mentioned those are used, but infrequently,
Very infrequently.
and that has to do with the cost, I would imagine?
Cost and challenges around comfort leveled by the fisher and by the observer. Also, it's hard to make it a career and become an expert because fishing days are sort of few, and so experienced observers are hard to come by as well, so there's real challenges that way.
And the expense and these other limitations that you're discussing make it not a very favorable way of monitoring the fishery, I suppose.
To get reasonable sample sizes in the fishery of observed fishing days is very challenging.
Would you agree with me that it could be cost prohibitive as well?
Yes, especially in the smaller, in fisheries that have smaller sort of gross profitability, I guess.
Okay. Mr. Jantz, I noticed you were nodding at that. Did you have anything you wanted to add?
It is cost prohibitive, I believe, for the very reasons that Dr. Houtman.
I'm not sure how familiar you are with this Project 7 report. It was in the list of documents for Commission Council. I believe they provided you with it.
Yep. Recently,
Yes? You're comfortable with it? Okay. I am going to take us through a couple of tables that are contained in this report, if that's all right. You feel that the catch monitoring of the commercial fishery, Mr. Houtman, is quite good
that's right.
in terms of the, okay. If we could go, sorry, Mr. Lund, to page 17 of this report. And Mr. Parslow, you said that you think for the First Nations fishery, the catch monitoring is good?
Yeah, I would say it's reasonable to good, yeah.
Okay. In the lower part of this page, we have some definitions for this report. They went through, just so you know, I know you've read it, but they assessed the various methods for monitoring, and I appreciate you guys develop these programs and the work that you do at the DFO, so this is a bit of an assessment of the same sort of qualification that you're making when you say good and quite good. In the accuracy here, they've defined fair as likely biased, low in summer most years, good as any bias is likely to be small, and very good as complete enumeration of the catch. Do either of you want to modify the statements that you've made in terms of your confidence in the catch monitoring for the fisheries that you work with? Would you say that very good, I would say that's equivalent to quite good, that you have complete enumeration of the catch in the commercial fishery?
Then if you're going to use that definition, which is fine, then I'll say it's good, because I also said I thought it was sort of 95% of the total catch, so that's not complete.
Mr. Parslow?
Yeah, I would say similarly it would be in the good range.
Okay. I don't want to belabor this point, but I do want to just make clear that we've seen a little bit more on this qualification in comparison of these different fisheries. In Table 2 on page 21, the Canadian commercial fishery was rated as fair for the accuracy and good for the food, social, ceremonial, and economic opportunity.
Right?
There are a couple of other tables. I won't take us there right now because it's not necessary, but I am interested in going to the appendices, actually, where we have a bit more of a breakdown.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure if my friend has a question about the table, if we're just reviewing it.
Sorry. Are you uncomfortable with these ratings in Table 2? Fair for the commercial fishery?
Yeah, I was asked to review this section of this document, and I provided review comments. I'm not sure how far those review comments got, but yeah, at the time and still today, I would disagree with that rating for the Canadian commercial fishery as being lower than it should for accuracy. Regardless of those definitions we saw earlier, realize these are relative. So relative to the other fisheries in that table, I would say commercial gets too low a ranking.
Too low a ranking. Okay, and just to be clear, fair doesn't say lower than it should. It just says likely biased, low in summer most years.
Yep.
So if it's, okay. So if we were to turn to, if we could please, Appendix D, which is at the very back. I'm not sure exactly of the page number, Mr. Lund. Table D2. They don't have page numbers in this part of the report, so it's a bit tricky. I want to come back to this onboard observers issue. And looking at this table, we see the catch monitoring system, and this goes a bit to what my friend Ms. Gardner was discussing in terms of the variability amongst the different kinds of monitoring systems in the different fisheries and the different areas. And I'm noticing that the only one that I see here for onboard observers is in Area 29, the net fishery. Are there any onboard observers for anywhere else?
Where is Area 29? Sorry. Oh.
Sorry, it's the last of the Fraser panel areas before the non-panel areas, and the catch monitoring system says few onboard observers. I mean, you can just tell me if you know of other places where there
I don't know of any
onboard.
other fisheries that have anything more than a sprinkling of observers.
Okay, and I see that the average catch here from 2001 to 2009 was nearly 250,000 for this fishery. Just looking over at the Area 29 gillnet. Large fishery, second largest of
Right.
the ones listed. Yeah, okay. Then we'll just briefly go to the equivalent table for the First Nations fishery for the Fraser sockeye, which is just C1. Sorry. It's just 3 pages earlier. So C1, the first part of the table here, it's a breakdown by area and First Nations groups. And then again, we have the catch monitoring system.
I'm sorry, I don't have. I think you're at cross purposes.
Sorry?
I think you're at C5.
I'm at C1, or sorry, C3. It's table C1, it's at page C3.
Okay, I'm sorry.
That's okay. I would page numbers next time. Okay. All I really wanted to look at here was that there's a few mentions amongst the First Nations fishery of having onboard observers, and yet none of these fishery numbers seem to approximate the gillnet fishery, where we had a smattering of a few onboard observers.
Sorry, I'm not sure
Sorry,
of the question.
I'm just trying to make the point here that there are observers that are required, for example, for the First Nations Marine Society coordinated fishery. You need observers on board each seine vessel. That you must have fisheries guardians on board and report after offloading for the Juan de Fuca Strait and the Strait of Georgia. So they need on-board fisheries.
Yeah, I'm afraid I'm not sure, not knowledgeable about the First Nations fisheries in these.
Do you have any reason to dispute that they are required to have these on-board observers?
That was my understanding, but I'm not sure the reasons for it.
Okay, and we can see that the relative catch numbers are 20,000, 25,000. These are relatively small fisheries compared to the ones that we were talking about earlier, boat sizes.
Okay,
Yes,
20,000?
20,000,
And what's the other
25,000?
one? 25,000?
for the Strait of Georgia?
Yeah, that's smaller than 250,000, yes.
Okay, a fraction. Okay, so would it be a reach for me to say that for these smaller fisheries, having onboard observers is rather expensive requirement?
It might be. It depends. If it's one boat being able to catch that many fish, for example, I don't know. If it's a seiner, I really don't know what the cost is represented. Honestly, I don't know why you're laughing.
I'm sorry, do you want to go
And I
ahead,
think
Mr. Chan?
without knowing what the issues may be around the fishery itself, it's very difficult to comment on the kind of a program that they may have for it. They may have specific reasons and rationale for having observers on those boats. We aren't involved in those, so
Okay,
can't comment on it.
so I'll break it down then. It's very expensive to have onboard observers? Yes.
Yes, but I'll just add, I said earlier, it depends on the vessel as well.
Okay, so depending on the vessel. So if I can research this more and come back to you with specific vessels and say these are very small vessels, then you would say it would be perhaps cost prohibitive for them to have.
Yeah, I meant to say with commercial as well that, I didn't say specifically which types of vessels, but seiners are large and they take a lot of fish per hour of fishing and crew member, so they make a larger rate of income, and they can presumably carry an observer afford those costs easier than a small vessel with small catches. we're talking, I think a lot of this catch is by seine. That's why I was suggesting it might be more reasonable costs.
Okay. But it is expensive to have onboard observers. It's unusual in the commercial fishery.
Yes.
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 Okay, I swear, the transcript won't show you're nodding, so I'm just...
Yep, that's right, yes.
Okay. And it's... Okay. We don't see it very much in the commercial fishery.
Correct.
We see it several times mentioned for the First Nations fishery.
We do.
Okay. And I just wanted to go to one more table. Now, I've read the policy and practice report. I appreciate you didn't prepare it yourselves, but you all work for DFO, correct? Okay. Are you, any of you familiar with working with Douglas Treaty First Nations?
No. So are those the Douglas Treaty Nations on the island?
Yes.
Okay, no. I'm not.
Sorry.
No.
Everybody's saying no. Are you aware of any programs that are specific to the Douglas Treaty Nations?
No.
Any catch monitoring or reporting programs that are specific to them?
No.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe just a note for the record, the last question that was asked, Mr. Jantz shook his head in the negative. Mitchell Taylor, I have one re-examination question of Dr. Houtman, and it concerns Ms. Sharp's questions of you on Project 7. And she took you, that's Exhibit 718, and she took you to a chart that was on page 21 that listed ratings by fishery for accuracy, amongst other things. Yes, right there. Dr. Houtman, you wouldn't agree with the rating that's there for Canadian commercial fare, and said you had a different view, and you'd made a comment previously. What is your assessment? What would you rate it at as compared to either independently or as compared to the other ratings you see on that page?
Independently, I'd rate it as good.
Microphone, please.
Independently, I would rate it as good. You didn't ask me to rank them, so I won't, but I would rank it fairly, well, I'll rank it fairly high as well amongst the others.
Thank you.
Mr. Commissioner, it's Jennifer Chan again for the Commission, and I just have a few questions in redirect. My first question is to follow up on the questions that have been put to you on the disparity in monitoring in commercial versus economic opportunity fisheries. I just wanted to follow up. You're aware that there's a 100% dockside monitoring program for some of the commercial fisheries, is that correct? Would you agree with that?
In commercial fisheries, there is where there is quota management.
So that would be Area B seine and Area H troll?
Correct. Yeah, in the last year.
And Dr. Houtman, you were mentioning some of the additional monitoring programs that are in place for the Area E gillnet fishery, for example. I heard you speak to the logbooks that are in place. Are those logbooks also used for the economic opportunity fishery?
Not the same logbooks. I don't know if there's a logbook requirement for them, but I don't think there is.
No, there isn't a logbook requirement.
Is there a similar fish slip program for the economic opportunity fishery?
With the mandatory landing program that's in place, we have landing slips which are produced at each of the sites. So when the fish are counted by the monitor there, a slip is produced with copies provided to the fisher, the First Nation, and 2 copies to DFO.
Do they also go to the Canada Revenue Agency as the regular fish slip program
I
does?
don't believe the landing slip does.
Are there phone-in requirements as well for the start, the end, the cancel, and the pause phone-ins for the economic opportunity fishery?
No, we have a system where First Nations are required to designate fishers. So we have a list of fishers that may participate in the fishery. But outside of that, there isn't a hail program in place. Sorry, a start and fishing report in place.
So do these other monitoring programs that are in place for the Area E gillnet fishery, do those assist with the statistical defensibility of the 35% dockside monitoring program? Is that what you're trying to get at, Dr. Houtman?
It was. If you're going to base a catch estimate on a sample, like the 35% we've been talking about, then you need a strong estimate, a defendable estimate of the total population to expand that to. And in this case, it's the total population of vessels. And so with commercial vessels, start and end fishing reports are going to help improve the estimate of the population of boats that are out there. And also the fact that the boats are individually identifiable by unique vessel registration numbers assists that greatly.
Thank you. And we've heard about some resistance to the costs that are associated with dockside monitoring programs. Perhaps I'll put this to you, Mr. Parslow. Who pays for the 100% dockside monitoring or the catch validation for economic opportunity fisheries?
At the current time, it's covered off under AFS agreements.
So that comes from DFO?
Yeah, provided by DFO to the First Nations.
And my next question, if I could bring up exhibit number 844, please. This was tab 24 of the Commission's list of documents. Now, the question was put to you, Mr. Jantz and Mr. Parslow, I believe, about the uncertainty in funding from one year to the next. And my understanding is you agreed that that could lead to instability. I just wanted to ask, you were later asked the question of whether or not there were agreements worth about the same amount of money with little room to move things around from year to year. And I just wanted to reconcile your answers to those two questions. If there's the same amount of money from year to year, how does that reconcile with your answer earlier about instability in funding?
I'm not sure that this is the right table that you were referring to, but my comments about the instability is in relation to non-AFS funding dollars that we in the BC Interior receive. It's my actual operational O&M and salary budgets that I get from the federal government. So it's not the AFS programs. Those numbers and dollars associated with them are very consistent and have been for a number of years. It's the other funding pot that I draw from that has the instability to it.
Okay, so you weren't saying that it was, for example, for these, I bring up this chart because it shows, a decreasing amount, but $700 to just under $600,000 per year for the past 6 years for an organization, and you weren't speaking to that being unstable.
No, that's...
No, and this the reason why this is varying a lot is because depending on the fisheries that are planned for each year, because this organization is directed at monitoring fisheries, that will alter both the size of the agreement provided and what is expended over the course of the year. So, yeah.
Thank you. I wanted to follow up on the questions put to you about not monitoring illegal fisheries, and I asked you a question about that. I believe Canada also followed up. I just wanted to clarify, when you answer that question about not monitoring illegal fisheries, do you mean closed-time fisheries?
Yes.
Okay. And I just wanted to point you to a paragraph in the Commission's PPR, it's paragraph 174, and I wonder if it could assist in answering your question put to you earlier about the observers. It's at page number 78 of the PPR. Earlier about observers being put on boats in some of the First Nations fisheries. I believe the other chart said Strait of Georgia, but this one's South Coast for paragraph 174, and I wonder if you could take a chance just to read that paragraph. And I've asked you earlier if you were content with the description of fisheries monitoring and catch reporting for the First Nations fisheries, including this section, and I wonder if it assists that you see that some of these First Nations may not have AFS agreements, and that might be a reason for different requirements in catch monitoring.
I'm not sure that we have the right people here to comment on the particular fishery that's outside of our area, and Rob is not involved in the monitoring programs around this particular area in the group. So I don't know that we can answer your question.
Okay, thank you. I'll leave that one then. Those are my questions. Thanks.
I just wanted, just for clarification to the panel, we talked about sales slips, and I took it, I hope correctly, that you were talking about fish processing. In other words, the sale of fish to a fish processor. Is that correct?
Fish slips are generally...
Your mic's not on. Yeah, that's good.
Fish slips are generally produced at that point where the fish are landed to a processor, although to a packer as well, a fish slip needs to be generated. They also technically need to be generated when there's a direct sale to public.
That's what I wasn't clear about, because you mentioned direct sales as well, and I wasn't sure whether you were talking about that as well.
Yeah, so in a direct sale to public, there is a requirement for the fisher in that case to generate a fish slip or a sales slip.
But you're not familiar with the process for collecting those slips?
No, but what there has been is a review, and the concern is that as direct sales have become more common, those slips are hard. The compliance with returning those slips or getting them to the department is low. So that's led to the total amount of catch represented on fish slips or sales slips to be a lower and lower fraction of the total.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I take it that's Mr. McGowan?
That concludes today, Mr. Commissioner. We have another panel tomorrow morning at 10 a.m.
Okay, thank you very much. I want to thank the members of the panel for attending at the commission and for your willingness to answer the questions of council. I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
Hearing is now adjourned for the day. We'll resume at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.